Thank you so much, Peter. It does strike me that I come from, after this morning and then before the fourth talk, for a very embarrassingly small historical slice, only 5,000 years of literary production. But even so, I think there's a certain commonality with the other talks today of exploring a deeper history than we normally find. In my case, going back to the earliest case, in a certain sense, the explosion that creates the universe of written literature comes about the third millennium BCE with the discovery of writing and all that it can do. Just to give one example, the Egyptian scribes, this is almost 3000 BCE, 4500 BC, 2500 BC, 2800. They discover they can put the whole world into a word, and these words are visual as much as they are anything else. So here we have a thief is trying to steal this grain, which will provide important DNA evidence later for his diet, of course. The guard baboon has caught him, and he's speaking to the guard. And here at the beginning, this feather is like an I, and this vulture is like as an A. So that first word in this context, I think, should be translated, yeah! He said, yeah, hit the baboon, get the baboon off me. So here in this tomb forever, you have this moment, right, of theft and of translation across media. So world literature comes into the world in this kind of explosion, but it also comes very personally. I thought I'd just give a little personal example of how literature comes into one's world. The first book that I really read for grown-ups as a teenager, The Life and Experiences of Tristram Shandy Gentleman, when I was, I think, 15. I thought it was so great. I thought, well, where do I go from here? Well, Tristram Shandy was my guide. Among the many opinions that crowd out his life story, he speaks at one point of my dear Rabelais and my dear Cervantes. I did not know anything about those gentlemen, but if they were good enough for Tristram Shandy, they would be good enough for me. So I devoured both Don Quixote and Gargantua and Pantagruel in the venerable Penguin Classics translations. And by midsummer, I was hungry for more, but where to go next? How do we discover world literature beyond? So in one case, the author recommends other authors. In another case, the publisher does. So I looked in the back of my Penguin editions, and they would list other books you might want. And I thought, well, I'd love to find another rollicking satire, another hilarious comedy. So I settled on a likely title, The Divine Comedy. What could be better than this? I soon discovered that Dante's epic was not quite the fun fest I'd been anticipating. But I was drawn in by his cosmic vision and his melancholy eloquence. As summer waned and the new responsibilities of 10th grade approached, I decided I wanted another deeply serious, otherworldly work. So I came upon the perfect title in the back of my Penguin Paradiso, Dead Souls by Nikolai Gogol, which sounded just as gloomy, but in fact, it was the sparkling satire that I thought that Dante was going to be. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, as Wordsworth would say, but to be a young reader was very heaven. Now, for most of the 20th century, the field of comparative literature in which I grew up was largely focused on the major Western European powers. In 1960, the Swiss-American comparatist, Werner Friedrich, complained that the world literature courses of those days were hardly living up to their name. Sometimes, he wrote, in flippant moments, I think we should call our programs NATO literatures. Yet even that would be extravagant, for we do not usually deal with more than 1/4 of the 15 NATO nations, as there were in 1960. But Friedrich was not calling for an expansion of comparative studies. Instead, he recommended dropping the term world literature altogether. What took me farther from Europe than the ancient Near East was a chance encounter with another world entirely. In my first semester in college, I took a survey course in Western art, but the instructor happened to be a Mesoamericanist, and he included a week on his specialty. I decided to write my term paper on a massive statue of the Aztec goddess Coatlicue, mother of the gods of mortals, adorned with a necklace of severed hands and hearts, crowned with a pair of serpents in place of her head. Looking for some insight into its uncanny iconography, I came on a book called Aztec Thought and Culture by a great Mexican scholar, Miguel León Portilla, who quoted many of the Aztec poems to illustrate their worldview. I thought the poems are strikingly beautiful, even in a translation of a translation. and I determined to study the language one day if I had the chance. 4 years later, I found a graduate course in Nahuatl, taught in the anthropology department. No one in literature was studying this material. When I asked my director of graduate studies for permission to take the course, he threatened to throw me out of his office window. This was on the 8th floor of the building. It was a momentary sense of vertigo. But he did let me take the course. And so now I can bring the original into class along with the translation to let my students hear the eloquent irony with which the Aztec poets came to terms with the loss of their pre-conquest world. Here's just one example. Coatlicue, keskichkatali tatilo, oh, akachalchutli, ak atelquitlat. How many jewels, how many quetzal plumes have been destroyed? Oh, though it was jade, though it was gold. But then he changes in the middle of the stanza. In ma'ika anshonawiakan, ma'ika an populiwi a in tota okol ante pilwan. So they may be happy, for surely too will perish our sorrow, my lords. Then it goes back. In ma'ika ampapapaki ontoyolo ye'ewa in tautikpak, zan kolatishi ton tishimati, zan titotanuika yenikan. So let us now rejoice within our hearts, all who are on earth. Only briefly do we know one another. Only here are we together. But now he changes again. Makashita koyakan ante pilwan. Ayak, mokautias in tautikpak. So don't be saddened, my lords. No one is left behind on earth. During the past quarter century, the study of world literature has expanded dramatically beyond the range of the NATO literatures, even more than NATO has expanded. The students and faculty in my department at Harvard are working now on a host of languages that had rarely, if ever, found a home in comparative literature before. Arabic, Bosnian, Korean, Polish, Wolof, Yiddish, along with French, German, Spanish, Russian, and English. It's been the great intellectual adventure of my life to help expand literary studies into something approaching a global reach. And this hasn't only been an intellectual endeavor, but an ethical and political one as well. As Miguel Leon Portilla found with Aztec poetry, literature offers us an exceptional mode of entry into the thoughts of people who are different from us in space and across time. In our conflict-ridden world today, we desperately need better understanding, both of our commonalities and of the distinctive identities of cultures beyond our own. That said, we can't forget that languages can always be used as weapons. As the grammarian Antonio de Nebrija declared to Queen Isabella of Castile in the fateful year 1492, siempre fue la lengua compañera del imperio, language has always been the companion of empire. Throughout history, conquistadores have always done their best to suppress local languages and to impose their languages and their literature in their place. Of the thousands of painted books that the Mayans treasured at the time of the conquest, only 4 survive today. In 19th century Europe, nationalists frequently suppressed minority languages and dialects, from Irish and Welsh in the so-called British Isles to Alemannic and Romansh in Switzerland. The persisting afterlife of such linguistic nationalism is well illustrated by a decree that Mussolini sent out, forbidding people in Istria to speak or, interestingly, to sing in Croatian. This was a major concern for the editors of the first journal of world literature, the Acta Comparationis Literarum Universarum, here we get to the universe of literature, which was founded in 1877 in the Transylvanian city of Cluj, now Romania. As the lead editor, Hugo Meltzel, observed in the inaugural issue of his journal, by now every nation demands its own world literature without quite knowing what is meant by it. By now, every nation considers itself, for one good reason or another, superior to all other nations. Instead of giving free rein to polyglottism, every nation today insists on the strictest monoglottism by considering its own language superior or even destined to rule supreme. This is a childish competition whose result will finally be that all of them remain inferior. Meltzer was probably the first person who ever compared the less commonly spoken literatures to endangered species. As he wrote in the same essay, in a time when certain animal species, such as the mountain goat and the European bison, are protected by strict laws, the willful extinction of a human species, or its literature, which amounts to the same thing, should be impossible. He went on to condemn a recent Russian ukaz that had prohibited writing Ukrainian in Ukraine. He's outraged. He said, this would be a greatest sin against the Holy Spirit, even if it were directed only against the folk songs of an obscure horde of Kyrgyzs instead of a people of 15 million. These are words that remain all too relevant today. Languages can be weaponized, but they can also protect local cultures from absorption by foreign powers. As George Steiner, who won the Balzan Prize in 2009, remarked in his book After Babel, a language builds a wall around the middle kingdom of the group's identity. It is secret towards the outsider and inventive of its own world. There have been so many thousands of human languages, human tongues there still are, because there have been so many distinct groups intent on keeping from one another the inherited singular springs of their identity and engaged in creating their own semantic worlds, their alternatives. And here we see his own book being translated. I love particularly the German translation, which is, it's as though it's in Hebrew, written in the opposite direction. The Tower of Babel itself, evoked in Steiner's title, gives a good illustration of this. The biblical writer claims that God decided to confuse the Babylonians' language as they're building this impious tower threatening heaven, to keep them from completing it and attacking heaven. He says, come, let us go down and confuse their language so they won't understand each other. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world and scattered them over the face of the earth. This is a satiric etymology, which ignores the obvious derivation of Babylon from the Akkadian Bab Ile, meaning a gate of God, the God being the patron deity, Marduk. The Tower of Babel story is often read as a tragedy of loss and dispossession, but it may really suggest an opposite meaning. It's a kind of a story of resistance, an account of how Akkadian lost its claim to be spoken by everyone in the world, thanks to the impious pride of the Babylonians. Imperial languages themselves can be used to preserve the traditions that they threaten. We see this in colonial New Spain, where the Spanish imposed the Roman alphabet on the native languages after they destroyed the hieroglyphic books. In one image, the natives' names are shown in hieroglyphs, you see here. 7 deer and 8 rabbit are their names, even as the massive friar with his portable writing desk is dominating the scene. Yet the poems that drew me to study Nahuatl survive today thanks to the Roman alphabet. Aztec poetry had been a purely oral tradition. But in the mid-1500s, 2 collections were compiled at the request of friars who wanted to understand what their congregants were singing, and ideally to repress it, but they collected the material to find out what it was. And so we have a body of 300 remarkable poems that otherwise would have been lost forever. Here you can see in one of these manuscripts, the heading of the poem just says, Nikan Pewa Tepanitsquikado, which means here begins a log drum song. But I think you can see also the pride of the scribe. Oh, look, he can describe here it is on the page. Something similar happened after Christianity came to Iceland in the year 1000. The Norse gods were soon eclipsed, but their stories continued to provide poetic imagery and allusions. But by the early 1200s, the meaning of these allusions was fading from memory. Runes had only been used to inscribe things on wood or stone, not for literary compositions, and the material was simply being forgotten. And a writer named Snorri Sturluson compiled a major compendium, the Prose Edda, to try to bring these stories together. He was a committed Christian, but he was also a great writer. And he was anxious for young poets to know the stories behind all the imagery they were using, lest the old poetic tradition die out. Snorri was well aware that the traditions he cherished were under attack by the new Christian order in which he was a participant. But in a prologue to his book, he describes the growth of the human race in terms of a material gain, but also a memory loss. So he's really interested in the same issues of migration and the kind of what's in the cultural DNA, you might say. I think it's not just metaphoric to speak of it that way. He says, and I quote, as the population of the world increased, the great majority of mankind, loving the pursuit of money and power, left off paying homage to God. This grew to such a pitch that they boycotted any reference to God. Then how could anyone tell their sons about the marvels connected with him? In the end, they lost the very name of God. And there was not to be found in all the world a man who knew his maker. Now, Snorri is supposedly talking about the ancients who forget the true God, whose name will come back with Christianity, but his book is devoted to telling young poets about the marvels performed precisely by the pagan gods, whose names are being boycotted under Christianity. This concern for cultural memory is expressed within the Prose Edda by no less a figure than the chief god, Odin. Two ravens sit on his shoulder. I'll come to this in a second, leading into this. Two ravens sit on his shoulders and bring to his ears all the news they see or hear. You can see the ravens there, faintly there. They're called Hugin, whose name, if the root means thought, and Munin, whose name means memory. He sends them out at daybreak to fly over the whole world, and they come back at breakfast time. By this means, he comes to know a great deal about what's going on in the world, and on account of this, men call him the god of ravens. As it is said, Hugin och Munin flyga fler än dag, jormen grund yfer. Get Hugin att han aften komme, då skamkak mer at Munin. Hugin and Munin fly every day over the vast expanse of the earth. I fear that Hugin, thought, will not come back, but I'm more concerned about Munin, memory. Odin is the god of wisdom. He is blessed but also cursed with foreknowledge, virarigya. He knows that he can only use the raven's reports for a while, until the gods enter their fated twilight and fade from memory. One day Munin will fail to return. But Odin is also the god of poetry, and perhaps he foresees the day when poets will adopt the script brought by the new dispensation that will displace him, and will use it for themselves. Resisting the oblivion threatened by advancing culture, these poets will celebrate their former patron god and his marvelous deeds, and their poems will keep alive the memory of the raven named Memory. Now, to close, in gratitude for the generosity of the Balzan Foundation, I'll take an Italian writer as my final example of a world author. Italo Calvino was an anti-fascist like Eugenio Balzan, and like Balzan, he spent most of his career in publishing, in his case not in Milan but in Turin, working for Einaudi. In my favorite of his books, I think his masterpiece, Le Città Invisibili, Calvino builds on the lasting memory of a worldly work by a great Italian predecessor, Marco Polo. Calvino imagines a series of conversations between Marco Polo and Kublai Khan in the emperor's twilight garden during the years when Marco was supposedly a roving ambassador for the Mongol emperor. Marco reports on the cities he's visited around China, describing them under headings such as cities and signs, cities and eyes, cities and the dead. We seem to be lost in a distant, fantastical past, but modernity increasingly intrudes. One city is so overpopulated that no one can move an inch. Another city is about to be crushed beneath towering mountains of garbage. By the book's end, New York and Washington, D.C., mentioned by name, have merged into a single continuous city, as have Tokyo, Kyoto, and Osaka. As Calvino once remarked, and I give this pun here, the invisible cities, or città invisibili, are a dream born in the heart of the unlivable cities, città invivibili, the continuous, uniform cities that keep on covering the globe, he says. His book crosses the borders between past and present, east and west, utopia and dystopia, viewing the modern world through multiple lenses of worlds elsewhere. So what can a writer or a scholar do amid the global problems of warfare and environmental crisis? I take heart from Marco Polo's description of his worldly project. The empire, he tells Kublai Khan, is sick. What is worse, it is trying to become accustomed to its sores. This is the aim of my explorations. Examining the traces of happiness still to be glimpsed, I gauge its short supply. If you want to know how much darkness there is around you, you must sharpen your eyes, peering at the faint light in the distance. At times, all I need is a brief glimpse, an opening in the midst of an incongruous landscape, a glint of light in the fog, a dialogue of two passers-by meeting in the crowd. And I think that setting out from there, I'll put together piece by piece the perfect city made of fragments mixed with the rest. In the book's concluding lines, Marco and Calvino offer what I would say is a good agenda for any literary critic or any humanist who wants to push back against the world's intractable conflicts. The inferno of the living, another Dante reference, of course, is not something that will be. If there is one, it is what's already here. The inferno where we live every day, that we form by being together. There are two ways to escape suffering it. The first is easy for many. Accept the inferno and become such a part of it that you can no longer see it. The second is risky and demands constant vigilance and apprehension. Seek and learn to recognize who and what in the midst of the inferno are not inferno. Then make them endure. Give them space. Thank you.